Hello, my name's Shoebridge. Welcome to this video. Now, over the last few weeks, for various reasons, I've been playing around with a lot of different synthesizers. Generally small desktop synthesizers, generally analog, generally monophonic. Not all of them, but most of them. Quite affordable little devices. I'll give you an idea here as to the kind of synths I've been playing around with. I've been playing around with them because I am developing some software which will hopefully be able to control them. But one of these little boxes, one of these little synthesizers really stood out to me. I was really quite taken aback by how good it really is. I really do think it might be a very underrated monosynth. So there's one particular synth I want to talk about in this video. It is the Waldorf Pulse 2. So what is the Pulse 2 from Waldorf? Well, it's a 3-oscillator analog monosynth. Well, I say monosynth, but it actually has some paraphonic modes as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And I say analog, it is an analog synthesizer. It's got analog oscillators, analog filter and amplifier section. It does have a digital effect at the end of the signal chain, which is a distortion effect, but you can bypass that. So you do have an analog signal path if you want it. So it's 3 oscillators, and 3 oscillators is pretty cool to have in a monosynth. If we look at all the sort of the flagship Moog synths that they've come out with since the Voyager was discontinued, we've got the little fatty, the sub fatty, the sub 37, the subsequent 37, the subsequent 25. They're all 2 oscillator synthesizers. Yeah, they have a sub oscillator, but they have 2 oscillators. And I just don't understand why Moog don't give us a 3 oscillator synth. We've got it in the Pulse 2. The Pulse 2 has 3 oscillators. It's got a single filter, but it's a multi-mode filter. It can do low pass, band pass, high pass. It's got 4-pole and 2-pole options. So a very flexible filter in that respect. There are 2 envelope generators, there are 2 LFOs, there is a flexible mod matrix, so you really have got a lot of power there in terms of the modulations that you can put together. It was released in 2013 by Waldorf, which seems like a very long time ago now, but very surprisingly you can still buy it brand new. So they're still selling it today. I just checked out the new prices from the main retailers in the UK. We're talking about £350. £350 for all of that power. But it's fine having all of that power, but what does it actually sound like? So what does it sound like? I've got a very simple patch here. I am using all 3 of the oscillators, but it sounds like this. Let's just listen to one of the oscillators. So I'm going to turn down number 3 and number 2. Let's just listen to number 1. It's got that creamy moginess, hasn't it? You see there that the P, as soon as I started to change the controls here on the matrix, that P for program or patch changed to E for edit. One thing I really do love about the Pulse 2 is that it remembers your edits. So I'm in the middle of editing this patch. If I go off to another patch, find something else I want to listen to, even edit those other patches, when I come back to 499, it's remembered my edits, which is something that I don't think any other synths do. If I want to get back the original patch, I just press Shift and Utilities, and I've got recall sound. I can initialize the sound, compare the sound to the previous one, save it, load it, dump it, etc. So let's just recall what I had before. One thing I haven't mentioned about the Pulse 2 is it's got a really comprehensive arpeggiator. If we go to the ARP, you'll see there on the screen, this is one of the rare occasions where Waldorf are actually using the screen to its full potential. Here we can see the settings for the arpeggiator, and it's basically a 16-step sequencer. Press it again, and then we can go to the individual steps inside. Let's listen to it, shall we? A little bit of delay. So with the user interface, we get the classic Waldorf matrix. It's what they're famous for, isn't it? Let's face it. We have a sort of a column of buttons down the left-hand side here, one for each row, so you can select the row, and then we have a set of rotary encoders along the bottom here for changing the values. It is a classic Waldorf interface. Now, I'm just trying to remember when I first bought a Pulse 2. It was a long time ago. It was a number of years ago, and I bought it to replace a Pulse version 1, which is a rack-mounted synth, but again, it's got this matrix interface. In fact, I used to own quite a number of Waldorf synths. They all had this matrix interface. It was absolutely fine at the time, but I kind of got bored with it. And you know, there was a point in time when we came out with sort of like more knobby, slidery interfaces. You know, people started to really appreciate those. Rack-mounted synthesizers became quite unpopular, and it was all about, you know, the hands-on control. So, you know, there was a time when the Pulse 2 would have been popular, but synthesizers, like all the Moog synthesizers that I've mentioned so far, really are very popular for their hands-on control, the one knob per function kind of approach. And it was exactly the same with me. I got kind of bored with this way of interacting, or it was just refreshingly nice to have a synth with a lot of sliders buttons and knobs where you could really sort of like see instantly what your patch was all about. So I mean, that was a reason for me why I kind of moved away from the Pulse 2. It probably was the main reason, I have to say, was the interface. And you know, you just want to try out new things. You want to try out new synths and see what inspires you, and that's absolutely fine. But I'm surprised using this synth after those years. I thought that I was going to be a bit bored with this whole way of working, or find it difficult. Not bored. Bored is not the right word. Find it, you know, a bit of a pain. Especially I was playing around with a lot of other different synthesizers. They've all got different interfaces. But actually I found it really, really refreshing and straightforward. I guess maybe because I haven't used a matrix style synthesizer for quite a long time. Right, so no conversation about the Pulse 2 would be complete without talking about its waveforms and its oscillators. We have 3 oscillators. They are actually digitally controlled analog oscillators, so they are DCOs. And they're DCOs, I guess, because they can do some pretty interesting things. I mean, this synth is famed for its crazy 8-note paraphonic mode. And how you can get an 8-note paraphonic mode out of 3 oscillators is a little bit of a mystery. I mean, I've read the explanations in a number of magazine reviews that came out when this synth was released, and I've read Waldorf's own website and looked at their own explanation, and it's all a little bit woolly. I was talking to someone the other day. I mentioned that I was doing the review of the Pulse 2, and they seemed to be convinced that this was actually a digital synthesizer because it is impossible to get 8-note paraphonic mode out of a 3 oscillator analog synthesizer. And on the face of it, it does sound rather weird, doesn't it? But actually inside here are 8 square wave or pulse wave oscillators. They are analog oscillators. There's 8 of them. But there are only 3 sawtooth and triangle analog oscillators or waveform generators inside here. So it has actually got 8 different analog pulse wave circuits, and that's why it can do what it can do. One other thing that's a little bit confusing about the Pulse 2 is that the waveform choices change from one oscillator to the next. So for example, oscillator number 2 has got some cross mod options. You can choose a cross mod between it and oscillator number 1, or between it and oscillator number 3, and the other oscillators don't have that option. Oscillator number 3, for example, that has got the least number of waveform choices, but you can disconnect it from the mixer section and instead use it to modulate the filter, or actually modulate the amplifier instead. So there are different things that you can do with these oscillators, which means, you know, you need to sort of like get your head around all the possibilities, and there are a lot of possibilities with this synthesizer. Let's just walk through the waveforms for oscillator number 1, because that's the most comprehensive list of choices, and we will get on to this famed paraphonic mode as we do so. So I've got here an initialized patch. Initialized patch for Pulse 2 means a pulse wave. And we've got control over the pulse width. It goes right down to 0, so silence. So that's the square wave. Then we have sawtooth. It's a nice sounding sawtooth, I like it. After that we have triangle. Then we get something called APW, which is alternate pulse width. Now I haven't looked at this on the oscilloscope, but it's a much more buzzy kind of square wave. But it comes into its own when you modulate the pulse width. Tones in there, really nice sounding. After that waveform we have unison. So this is unison 8 individual square wave or pulse wave oscillators playing at the same time, detunable. So we've got the key track control turns into detune. So this is with none. And it gets crazy, as you'd expect. And we've got control over the pulse width. Nice sounding those. It sounds a little bit thin though, but it sounds nice. After that we have another unison mode. Now this is unison paraphonic mode. Now this is very similar to the smart kind of paraphonic mode on a monopoly. If I hold down one note, I'll get all the oscillators, but as I hold down more than one note, those oscillators get sort of like spread out between the notes. So with the Pulse 2, I hold down 1, we're hearing 8. I hold down 2 notes. Now it's allocated 4 oscillators to each note, and then I don't know what happens next, but obviously I could hold down up to 8 notes at the same time. And then after those different waveforms and modes, we have got unison, but with the alternate pulse width oscillators. And you can probably guess the next mode. It is, yeah, it's the paraphonic mode with that particular alternate pulse wave. After all of those modes, we get into the famed paraphonic mode, which is the 8 voice. I was going to say, yeah, 8 voice. It's not really voices, is it? It's 8 oscillator, 8 note paraphonic mode. This is with a regular pulse width waveform, and if I hold down one note, I just hear the one oscillator allocated to each note. Much quieter. I mean, even just one note on its own, that's just one square wave. It's really quiet compared to the regular square wave. And that's one of my complaints really about the Pulse 2, is that the volume of a patch can vary an awful lot depending on the choices you make. You've got the resonance. As you turn up the resonance on the filter, that makes the whole volume of the patch drop away, as is, you know, classic with a Moog ladder style filter, but you've got these different waveforms as well that can be really quiet. And actually with the factory presets, from one preset to the next, there's quite a variation in the levels. I'm constantly going to the overall volume control and compensating for the difference in levels. It's a bit of a shame, to be honest with you, but it is what it is. One last mode, and that is, after that paraphonic 8 voice, is a paraphonic 4 voice, and this is basically pairing up oscillators 1 and 2. They're both still restricted to square waves, but you can then detune them, set semitones differently if you want to with them, and you can set the pulse widths separately between them as well. So there's an awful lot of choices there in terms of waveforms, but as you can tell, the synth really is centered around these different pulse width, pulse wave waveforms. And I guess that's obvious because it's called the Pulse 2. You know, I keep forgetting to mention capabilities about the synthesizer in the video, which really are, you know, like standout features for a little mono synth. I mean, have I mentioned, for example, that it's actually a stereo synthesizer? We've got these stereo outputs here. There's not a great deal you can do in terms of stereo. You can't place oscillators, you know, within the stereo field, for example, but you have got overall control over the stereo pan, and stereo pan is one of the modulation destinations in the mod matrix. So you can modulate it using LFOs, envelopes, using the key tracking, things like that. So you can get some really nice stereo effects with this synthesizer. Other things I really should mention about the mod matrix while we're looking at it. You can modulate the speed of the LFO, which is cool. Mod 1 amount. So there we are. We can actually modulate a modulation within the mod matrix, which is very, very good. What else have we got here? Glide rate. Okay, so here we've got change all of the filter envelope rates at the same time. So I don't know if you are familiar with the Dreadbox Typhon, but on the front panel of that wonderful little synthesizer, there's a couple of controls where you can either lengthen or shorten the whole filter envelope and amplitude envelope just with one turn of a knob. And here we have that same functionality in the mod matrix, so we can lengthen and shorten the envelopes. We've got the filter envelope and we've got the amplitude envelope as well, which is really, really nice to have. We've got the unison detune. When we're in unison mode, we can modulate that. What else have we got? We can modulate the swing of the arpeggiator. Oh yeah, and I haven't mentioned that there's a CV and gate output on the back of this synthesizer. And here we can set the CV out to whatever we want to using the mod matrix. And that's a really advanced feature. And then we have a bunch of mathematical functions, and this kind of like reminds me of a Moog 1 in some respects. We've got a bunch of different functions here for combining signals within the mod matrix, accumulate, product. We can delay a value in the mod matrix. We can smooth out values in the mod matrix, and we've got min and maximum. I mean, it's so comprehensive, this synthesizer. It really is a real feature-packed little monosynth. Okay, so this is the point of the video where I just want to talk about a few things that I think could be better on the Pulse 2, things that could be improved. They're not going to be, let's face it. You know, it's not a perfect instrument by any means. First thing I want to talk about, there's a couple of glaring omissions, I think. Well, certainly in my mind, there are a couple of glaring omissions. It's a monosynth. It's got 3 oscillators. Those are digitally controlled oscillators as well. This synth is going to be fantastic for bass lines as well as leads, but there's one capability it doesn't have, and that is per note or on note reset of the phase of those oscillators, which you get on some more advanced monosynths, which are orientated around doing bass lines in particular. So you don't get that ability to get really clean, repeatable beginnings to the notes. There's no phase reset capability. And I think that's a big omission. It's a shame that Waldorf haven't added it. I think it would be probably fairly straightforward to add, as these are digitally controlled oscillators. The other glaring omission to my mind is a simple 3-note paraphonic mode. Now, any analog synth that's a monosynth that gives you paraphonic capability allows you to play 1 note per oscillator. This doesn't do that, so we have these amazing 8 oscillators, but they're all pulse wave oscillators. Why can't we play the 3 oscillators that we've got here so that we could choose sawtooths or triangle waves or whatever else we want to, or mix up the waveforms? That's something that's missing. I think it's a really big shame. I missed that on this synth. What else can I say? Well, we've talked about the variation in volume with some of these different oscillator modes, the paraphonic mode versus the non-paraphonic modes. There's a big variation in sound, in volume of sound. We get that same kind of variation with the filters as well. Now, obviously, we've got a 4-pole low-pass filter here, and we get that classic drop-off in volume as you turn the resonance up. I'll just show you that. So as I turn up the resonance, it's very, very quiet. Right. And that's the case with lots of synthesizers that have a classic Moog style 4-pole ladder filter. There are some modern filter designs these days that will do some compensation, some gain staging, so that doesn't happen. This doesn't have it. That's the way it is. But that difference in volume is also there without resonance when we look at some of the other filter types. So this is maximum cutoff, no resonance with the low pass filter. Now let's go to a high pass filter and have minimum cutoff. It should sound exactly the same, but it's so much quieter. It's the same with the bandpass as well. If we choose bandpass, it's very quiet. I mean, it might just be my unit, it might be mine that needs some sort of recalibration or something, but I don't think it is. I've read other people with similar comments about the volume differences between patches and using various components within the synth architecture. So I don't think I'm alone with this. I mean, it's not, it's not the end of the world, but it just means that you're constantly riding the level control, which is a bit of a shame. But that's it really in terms of the limitations and things which I'd like to see improved with the synth itself. But when I go to the website, Waldorf's website, and I go to the section that has the Pulse 2, I tend to get the impression that it's a bit of a forgotten synthesizer as far as they're concerned, which I kind of understand on one hand, because it was released a number of years ago now, but on the other hand, they're still selling it, and it's it hasn't had a firmware update in 6 years. I think it could be improved further. When you look at the way that the screen is utilized or not utilized on the Pulse 2, compare that to the Blofeld. Why didn't they bring across some of those graphics and put them in the Pulse 2? When you're looking at the envelopes, etc. I just think it's just a bit of an unfinished job from that point of view. It would be nice to update it. And I mean, talking about the firmware, to get the latest firmware onto the Pulse 2, they actually deliver it as a MIDI file, which is rather strange. I guess it's a sysx file that's inside that MIDI file. But their recommendation on updating the firmware, if you have a Windows PC, is to use Windows Media Player. That's a very dated piece of software to be using. I mean, back 9 years ago, I'm sure it would have worked fine, or even 6 years ago it would have worked fine. But with the latest version of Windows, I'm not sure if there is an easy, straightforward way of being able to choose a MIDI device as the output to Windows Media Player for playing MIDI files. I ended up using my MacBook in order to update the firmware on my Pulse 2. Waldorf supply a piece of software that you can install that will do that for you on Apple Mac. And it's an incredibly dated and old-fashioned looking piece of software. It really is. So it's got this kind of dated feel about it, which is why I was surprised that you can still buy these synthesizers new. It's kind of forgotten. But then, you know, lots of synth manufacturers, they produce their products, they forget about them, and they move on to the next one. I guess it's life. That's really all I wanted to say about the Pulse 2. It is a fantastic, very, very capable synthesizer. And I was thinking to myself, you know, if the worst came to the worst and I had to sort of like sell everything and scale down, you know, what would I keep? What would be the things that I would keep? I mean, obviously there are synthesizers that are much more expensive and larger than this Pulse 2 that I'd love to keep. But if the worst came to the worst, this little unit here, you know, it does everything that you really need to get out of a monosynth. It's a 3 oscillator monosynth. It's packed full of potential and capabilities with its mod matrix, with all the different waveforms and the different modes that you've got here. It really is. And if you consider that brand new right now, you can pick these up for £350 in the UK. Just look at the used market. I think you can pick one of these up for just 200 or a little bit more than that. That's a really small amount of money to pay for a synth with so much capability and a wonderful sound. It really has got a great sound to it. So that's all I wanted to say about the Pulse 2. That's all I've got time for in this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been useful to you in some way. If you do own a Pulse 2, then please let me know your thoughts on it in the comment section below. Do you have these problems with volume variation? Do you find it limiting in any way? Is it a synth that's really, you know, stolen your heart or not? I'd really love to know what your comments are. Until the next video, as always, thank you very, very much for watching.